In 1885, Victoria Hayes boarded a train in Boston with nothing but a single trunk of possessions and a heart full of desperate hope. At 34, standing a towering 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached that height, society had already written her final chapter, but Victoria refused to accept that ending. What awaited her in Timber Creek, Montana, wasn't the fresh start she'd envisioned. It was public humiliation that would have broken a lesser woman. Yet fate has a peculiar way of bringing together souls who recognize themselves in each other. This is the story of how a woman mocked for her unusual height found her place in the most unexpected of circumstances, standing eye to eye with a man who saw her not as too tall, but as perfectly matched. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The January wind carried a bitter chill as it swept through Boston's cobblestone streets, finding every gap in Victoria Hayes's woolen coat, despite her best efforts to keep it closed at her throat. 34 winters had taught her that the cold was relentless in its pursuit, much like the whispers that followed her through the city's social circles. "Miss Hayes," Mrs. Thornton's voice called from the parlor as Victoria entered the boarding house, stomping snow from her boots. "A letter arrived for you this afternoon." Victoria paused, surprised. Few people wrote to her these days. Since her father's passing 2 years prior, correspondence had dwindled to obligatory holiday greetings from distant relatives who felt duty-bound rather than genuinely interested. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the envelope with gloved fingers. In the privacy of her small room, once the servants' quarters of what had been a grand home before financial necessity forced it into a boarding house, Victoria removed her coat and sat at the edge of her narrow bed. The return address showed Timber Creek, Montana Territory, and the name Daniel Weber. 4 months of correspondence had culminated in this final letter. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she broke. The seal. "My dear Miss Hayes, your latest letter confirmed what I had already determined. We are of similar minds and compatible temperaments. Though we have never met in person, I believe we could build a good life together here in Timber Creek. I run a successful general store, have a comfortable 2-story home, and can offer security and respect, if not the romantic notions young girls dream of. I have arranged for a train ticket to be held at the Boston station in your name, departing February 15th. If you accept my proposal of marriage, simply claim the ticket and telegraph your expected arrival date. If you decline, I understand completely and wish you well. With sincere regard, Daniel Weber." Victoria set the letter on her lap, gazing at her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall opposite her bed. The woman staring back at her was still handsome in her features. High cheekbones, clear green eyes, a straight nose, and full lips. But what everyone noticed first, what they couldn't seem to see past, was her height. Standing 6 feet tall since she was 16, Victoria towered over most women and many men. Her mother, also tall but not remarkably so, had called her "my elegant Cypress" when Victoria would come home crying after being teased at school. But Boston society saw only oddity, regardless of her pleasant face or refined manners. Her height had cost her more than vanity. Victoria had been engaged once to a promising young banker who had proclaimed her statuesque and regal despite her uncommon stature. But when a prettier, younger, more conventionally petite woman had shown interest, Victoria's fiancé had discovered concerns about cutting a proper figure as a couple and the impropriety of having a wife who stood taller than him at social gatherings. The broken engagement had been humiliating enough. The whispers that followed were worse. "Did you hear about poor Victoria Hayes?" James broke it off. "Can you blame him? With that height, she looks like she belongs in a circus sideshow. Such a shame. She might have made someone a good wife if not for that unfortunate condition." After her father died, leaving only debts and a house that had to be sold to pay. Them, Victoria had taken work as a teacher, her excellent education and impeccable diction becoming her sole means of support. While other women her age supervised households and raised children, Victoria taught other people's daughters and tried not to feel the sting of their pitying glances. Rising from the bed, Victoria moved to the small trunk in the corner of her room. Opening it, she removed a wooden box containing her most precious possessions, her mother's pearl earrings, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, and a small pouch containing the modest sum she had managed to save over 2 years of careful economy. Beside these, she placed Daniel Webber's letters. They were not romantic or particularly personal, but they were honest. A 42-year-old shopkeeper who had built a business in the growing Montana Territory, who wanted a partner rather than a pretty ornament. He had advertised in newspapers back east for a mature woman of practical skills and sensible disposition, and Victoria had answered, sending a truthful description of herself, including her unusual height. "I seek companionship and mutual respect," he had written, "not the fleeting passion that fades as quickly as youth." It wasn't love, but it was perhaps something more reliable, the chance at a life with purpose, beyond watching younger, smaller women live the future she had once imagined for herself. The next morning, Victoria gave notice at the school where she worked, ignoring the knowing looks exchanged between the headmistress and other teachers. She claimed the train ticket at the station and sent a telegraph to Daniel Webber, informing him of her expected arrival date in 3 weeks' time. "Going out west to be a mail-order bride?" the telegraph operator asked, not unkindly. "Brave woman. Hope he's a decent sort." "He seems to be," Victoria replied, her chin lifting slightly, "and I've always found that new territories often allow for new beginnings." The operator nodded. "True enough. My sister went to California 5 years back, married a fellow she'd never met. They've got 3 children now, and land of their own." Victoria smiled, allowing herself a moment of hope. For the next 3 weeks, Victoria methodically prepared for her departure. She sold what few pieces of furniture she possessed, carefully selected which clothes to take and which to leave behind, and sewed herself a new dress for her arrival, a practical but flattering navy wool that elongated her already tall frame, rather than trying to minimize it. The night before her departure, Mrs. Thornton invited Victoria to take tea in the main parlor, an unusual gesture given that the boarders typically kept to themselves. "I've run this boarding house for 15 years, Mrs. Thornton said as she poured the tea. "Seen all sorts come and go. Most women in your position would have settled for whatever scraps of security they could find here in Boston." Victoria accepted the cup. "I've never been one to settle, Mrs. Thornton." "No, you haven't." The older woman studied her with shrewd eyes. "That's why I think you might actually succeed out there. The West isn't kind to the weak-willed." "I may look like a redwood among daisies," Victoria said with a small smile, "but I assure you my roots run deep." "Good." Mrs. Thornton raised her cup in a toast. "To new beginnings, then." "To new beginnings," Victoria echoed, trying to ignore the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. The journey west was long and grueling. Victoria had traveled little in her life, and never farther than New York City. The constant motion of the train, the changing landscapes outside her window, the nights spent trying to sleep sitting upright, and the brief, uncomfortable stops at stations along the way, all tested her resolve. Yet with each mile that passed, beneath the train's wheels, she felt the weight of Boston's expectations and disappointments falling away. By the time the train approached Montana Territory, Victoria had developed a certain resilience to discomfort and a growing excitement about the life that awaited her. The mountains rising in the distance seemed to embody the challenges ahead, formidable but not insurmountable. When the conductor announced they were approaching Timber Creek, Victoria gathered her belongings and checked her appearance one last time in the small hand mirror from her reticule. Her face was clean and composed, showing the fatigue of travel, but also the determination that had carried her across the country. "Timber Creek Station," the conductor called as the train began to slow. "Timber Creek, Montana." The platform was modest compared to the grand stations of eastern cities, but bustling nonetheless. Victoria descended carefully from the train, her trunk following with the assistance of a porter. Her eyes scanned the crowd, looking for a man who might match the description Daniel Webber had provided, of average height, solid build, with brown hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Among the crowd, several men stood alone, clearly waiting for arriving passengers. One in particular seemed to be studying the women disembarking with particular interest. He matched Daniel's description, and when his eyes landed on Victoria, he stepped forward, then stopped, his expression freezing, as he took in her full height as she stood on the platform. "Miss Hayes?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Mr. Webber, I presume?" Victoria nodded, keeping her voice steady despite the familiar sinking feeling in her chest as she recognized the look of shocked dismay on his face. He removed his hat, revealing hair that indeed was brown but thinning considerably. "Welcome to Timber Creek." There was an awkward moment as they regarded each other, measuring the reality against whatever expectations they had formed. Victoria saw disappointment flash across Daniel's face, brief but unmistakable, as he took in her height. Though she had described it in her letters, seeing it in person clearly had a different impact. "Your journey was comfortable, I hope?" he asked, his tone polite but cooler than his letters had suggested. "As comfortable as one might expect," Victoria replied, maintaining her dignity despite the sinking feeling in her stomach. "It's a remarkable distance to travel," Daniel nodded, then signaled to a boy nearby. "Tommy will take your trunk to my wagon. We should get you settled at the boarding house before dark." "Boarding house?" Victoria questioned. "I had understood, that is, your letter implied I would be staying at your home." Daniel cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I thought it best you have some time to acclimate to Timber Creek before the wedding. Mrs. Wilson runs a respectable establishment for ladies. I've arranged for you to stay there for a week or two." The unspoken message was clear. He was reconsidering his proposal. "I see," Victoria said, keeping her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "How considerate of you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. The walk through Timber Creek's main street was mercifully brief. The town was larger than Victoria had expected. A proper main street lined with businesses, side streets with houses of varying sizes, and in the distance the sharp rise of mountains against the blue sky. Under different circumstances, she might have found it charming. Mrs. Wilson's boarding house was a two-story structure with a neat front yard and curtained windows. The proprietor herself answered the door, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, who looked Victoria up and down with undisguised surprise at her height, but notably without the usual mockery. "So you're Daniel's mail-order bride," she said by way of greeting. "Come in then. I've got your room ready upstairs." Daniel remained on the porch. "I'll call on you tomorrow, Miss Hayes. We have matters to discuss." After he departed, Mrs. Wilson showed Victoria to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Supper's at 6, she said. "Kitchen's closed after that, so don't be late." She paused at the door, her expression softening slightly. "He didn't tell you he was having second thoughts, did he?" Victoria set down her reticule on the bed. "No, he did not." Mrs. Wilson sighed. "Daniel Webber is not a bad sort, but he's always cared too much what others think. Been telling folks for weeks how he's ordered himself a proper Eastern lady to bring some refinement to his home." She glanced meaningfully at Victoria's towering frame. "I expect you weren't quite what he was picturing." "Apparently not," Victoria agreed, too tired to pretend otherwise, though I was entirely truthful in my letters. "Men hear what they want to hear," Mrs. Wilson said with a shrug, "and see what they want to see. Rest now. Things often look different after a good night's sleep." But morning brought no improvement. Daniel arrived at the boarding house just after breakfast, his expression grave as he asked Victoria to accompany him on a walk. They strolled toward the town square, maintaining a proper distance between them despite their supposed engagement. "Miss Hayes," he began once they were away from the boarding house, "I find myself in a difficult position." "You wish to withdraw your proposal," Victoria stated simply, refusing to make this easier for him. Daniel had the grace to look ashamed. "It's not that I find you objectionable. You seem a refined and intelligent woman. It's just my height makes me appear too masculine for a wife," she finished for him. "Well, yes," he admitted, "and Timber Creek is a small community. People talk. A man in my position needs to maintain a certain image, and I would damage that image." The hurt was eclipsed by a rising anger. "You must understand," Daniel continued, oblivious to the fire kindling in her eyes. "I'm one of the founding businessmen of this town. People look to men like me to uphold standards. A wife who towers over her husband might suggest weakness in my judgment." Victoria stopped walking. "Mr. Weber, let me be perfectly clear. My height is a fact of my existence, nothing more. I'm 34 years old, educated and capable. I have traveled across the country based on your written promise of marriage, and now you stand here speaking to me of image and standards." Several passers-by turned to look at them, drawn by her raised voice. Daniel's face flushed with embarrassment. "Please lower your voice," he hissed. "This is precisely what I mean. A proper lady would show more restraint. A proper gentleman would honor his commitments," Victoria countered, "or at the very least would not hide behind social pretensions to mask his own insecurities." Daniel's expression hardened. "I see I was mistaken about your character as well as your appearance. The engagement is off, Miss Hayes. I'll provide funds for your return journey to Boston, but I expect you to depart on tomorrow's eastbound train." "Keep your money," Victoria said coldly. "I'd rather starve than accept another penny from you." With that, she turned and walked away, her back straight despite the crushing weight of her situation. She had spent nearly everything she owned on preparations for this new life. She had no home to return to in Boston, no position waiting for her, and now no future in Timber Creek. As she approached the boarding house, a small crowd had gathered outside the general store across the street. Daniel's store, she realized. With a fresh wave of humiliation, word had clearly spread quickly, and curious townspeople were openly watching her walk of shame back to Mrs. Wilson's. "That's her. Weber's mail-order mistake," she heard someone whisper, none too quietly. "Look at that height. She's a regular giantess," another voice replied. "Poor Daniel narrowly escaped being made a laughingstock." Each word struck like a physical blow, but Victoria kept walking, one foot in front of the other, until she reached the sanctuary of the boarding house. Mrs. Wilson met her at the door, concern etched on her kind face. "I heard," she said simply. "That man has the backbone of a garden slug." "He's not worth your contempt," Victoria replied, struggling to maintain her composure. "But I find myself in a difficult situation. I don't have the funds for an extended stay, nor for immediate return passage." Mrs. Wilson ushered her inside, away from prying eyes. "You can stay through the week while we figure something out. There's always a need for educated folk, even in a frontier town." "Thank you," Victoria said, gratitude momentarily overwhelming her pride. "I'll repay your kindness." "See that you do," Mrs. Wilson replied, practical as ever. "Now go wash your face and rest a bit. I'll bring up some tea." Alone in her room, Victoria finally allowed herself the luxury of tears, not for Daniel Webber, he deserved none of her emotion, but for the hope that had carried her across the country only to be dashed on the rocks of shallow prejudice. She had risked everything on this chance, and now found herself stranded in a hostile community where she was already an object of ridicule. As the afternoon light slanted through her window, Victoria made a decision. She would not be defeated by this setback. Somehow she would find a way to establish herself in Timber Creek, or earn enough to move on to another frontier town where her skills would be valued. She had survived disappointment before. She would survive this too. Little did Victoria know that 40 miles outside of town, on one of the largest cattle ranches in the territory, news of Webber's too-tall bride was about to reach a man who had his own reasons to be interested in a woman judged too quickly by her unusual stature. 3 days after her public humiliation, Victoria sat in Mrs. Wilson's parlor, writing application letters to schools in nearby towns. The irony wasn't lost on her, seeking teaching positions similar to the one she had abandoned in Boston, while her dreams of a fresh start had unraveled so completely. "Your penmanship is exquisite," Mrs. Wilson remarked, examining Victoria's work. "The school board in Henderson might be interested. Their teacher left mid-term to get married." "I'm glad to be of use," Victoria replied, sealing an envelope and grateful for Mrs. Wilson's practical assistance. "And I'm grateful for your allowing me to stay while I reconsider my options." Mrs. Wilson settled into a nearby chair with her knitting. "Any thoughts on what those options might be? Daniel's been telling anyone who will listen that he generously offered to pay your way back east." Victoria's fingers stilled momentarily. "Yes, very generous of him to clean up his own mess," she said dryly. "But as I told you, I have nothing waiting for me in Boston. My father is gone, our house sold to pay debts, and my position at the school has surely been filled." The older woman nodded thoughtfully. "Timber Creek isn't an easy place for a woman alone, especially one who's already been the subject of gossip. But there's always Denver, bigger city, more opportunities for someone with your education." "Perhaps," Victoria agreed, though the prospect of starting over yet again in another unfamiliar place was daunting. "I'll need to earn enough for the fare first." A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Wilson rose to answer, returning moments later with a tall, elegantly dressed woman who surveyed the parlor with keen interest. "Miss Hayes, this is Mrs. Eleanor Roberts. She's heard about your situation and has a proposition for you." Victoria stood, smoothing her skirts, immediately aware of the contrast between her simple traveling dress and Mrs. Roberts's fashionable attire. More striking, however, was that Mrs. Roberts stood nearly as tall as Victoria herself, perhaps only an inch or two shorter. "Miss Hayes," Mrs. Roberts extended a gloved hand, "I'm told you're a teacher from Boston." "I've had 5 years of experience," Victoria replied cautiously. "How may I help you?" "I run the only private academy in Timber Creek," Mrs. Roberts explained. "My Latin instructor has been called away, family emergency in St. Louis, and I find myself with 20 students and no one qualified to teach them." Hope flickered in Victoria's chest. "You're offering me employment?" "Temporary employment," Mrs. Roberts clarified. 6 weeks of work, possibly longer. The pay is fair, $3 per day, and you would lodge at the academy, not here." It was more than Victoria had earned at the Boston school, and enough to build a modest sum toward whatever came next. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning, 8 sharp." Mrs. Roberts handed her a card with an address. "The academy is on Maple Street, just off the main square. And Miss Hayes," she added, her eyes meeting Victoria's directly, "I expect my instructors to carry themselves with confidence. Your height is an asset in a classroom, not a liability. My students respond well to authority, particularly when it's presented with both physical and intellectual presence." The lack of criticism was so unexpected that Victoria merely nodded. "I'll be there promptly at 8, Mrs. Roberts." After the woman departed, Mrs. Wilson made a sound of satisfaction. "Eleanor Roberts is as practical as they come. She cares about results, not gossip." "She's offering honest work when I need it most," Victoria replied, "and she seems remarkably untroubled by my appearance." "Eleanor's close to 6 feet herself," Mrs. Wilson explained. "Married the shortest man in the county, too. Joseph Roberts barely comes up to her shoulder. They've been happily wed for 15 years and have 3 strapping sons." Victoria considered this unexpected information. Perhaps Timber Creek wasn't entirely populated by people who shared Daniel Webber's narrow views, after all. The next morning, Victoria arrived at Roberts Academy precisely at 8 gone, wearing her most professional dress and carrying a small valise with her immediate necessities. Mrs. Wilson had promised to send the rest of her belongings later in the day. The academy itself surprised Victoria. Rather than the rustic schoolhouse she had expected, it was an impressive 2-story brick building with large windows and an iron fence enclosing a spacious yard. A sign above the entrance proclaimed "Roberts Academy for Exceptional Education" in gold lettering. Mrs. Roberts greeted Victoria in the entrance hall, as tall and commanding as she had appeared the previous day. "Punctual. Excellent. Let me show you to your quarters first, then we'll discuss your duties." The living arrangements were far more comfortable than Victoria had anticipated. A small but well-appointed room on the academy's 2nd floor, with a private entrance from the side of the building, would serve as her home for the coming weeks. It had a proper bed, a writing desk by the window, a washstand, and a small bookcase already stocked with Latin texts. "This was to be Mr. Harrison's room," Mrs. Roberts explained. "He never arrived to claim it. Family emergency, as I mentioned." "It's more than adequate," Victoria replied, genuinely pleased. "Thank you." Mrs. Roberts nodded briskly. "Your classroom is downstairs, 3rd door on the left. 20 students, ages 13 to 17, all reasonably well behaved. They've been reading Cicero, though I suspect their translation skills need considerable refinement." "I'm familiar with Cicero," Victoria assured her. "He was a particular focus at my previous school." "Good. I'll introduce you at the morning assembly." "In half an hour." Mrs. Roberts paused at the door. "The students may be curious about you at first. Your height, your Boston background. Children are naturally inquisitive." Victoria had taught long enough to recognize the warning in Mrs. Roberts's words. "I understand. Novelty wears off quickly when confronted with Latin conjugations." A hint of a smile crossed Mrs. Roberts' face. "Precisely my thought. Welcome to Roberts Academy, Miss Hayes." The morning assembly went much as Victoria expected. 20 pairs of young eyes widened as she stood beside Mrs. Roberts at the front of the assembly hall. 2 tall women, commanding attention without saying a word. There were whispers, of course, and a few poorly concealed giggles, but Mrs. Roberts silenced them with a single stern glance. "Students, this is Miss Hayes from Boston. She will be taking over your Latin studies while Mr. Harrison attends to family matters. I expect you to show her every courtesy and apply yourselves diligently." "To your studies," Victoria stepped forward. "Thank you, Mrs. Roberts. I look forward to exploring the beauty and complexity of Latin with each of you." Her first class proceeded better than she had dared hope. The students, despite their initial curiosity about her height, quickly discovered that Miss Hayes expected attention and effort. By lunchtime, they were fully engaged in translating passages from Cicero's speeches, the novelty of her appearance forgotten in the face of academic challenge. As the school day ended, Victoria found herself genuinely enjoying the familiar rhythm of teaching. The students here were perhaps less polished than those in Boston, but they showed a refreshing eagerness to learn and seemed unconstrained by many of the social prejudices she had come to expect. At dinner, in the small faculty dining room, Victoria met the Academy's other teachers, Mr. Patterson, a middle-aged mathematics instructor with spectacles and a perpetual ink stain on his right index finger. Miss Collins, a young woman who taught natural sciences and seemed barely out of school herself, and Dr. Walsh, an elderly gentleman who handled history and literature with equal enthusiasm. "Boston, eh?" Dr. Walsh remarked as they dined on a simple but hearty stew. "I taught at Harvard for a time, found it stifling. Too many traditions, too little thinking." "What brought you to Montana Territory?" Victoria asked, curious about this cultured man so far from academic centers. He smiled, revealing a missing tooth. "Adventure, my dear. The chance to help shape minds unfettered by Eastern conventions, and a rather unfortunate gambling debt that made a hasty departure advisable." "Don't let him scandalize you," Mrs. Roberts interjected. "Thomas exaggerates for dramatic effect. He came west because his daughter married a rancher, and he couldn't bear to be separated from his grandchildren." Dr. Walsh chuckled. "Eleanor always ruins my colorful narratives with inconvenient truths." The easy camaraderie among the faculty was a stark contrast to the formal, often competitive atmosphere Victoria had experienced in Boston. Here, isolated from larger society, they had formed a close-knit community based on mutual respect and shared purpose. "You'll meet Joseph at Sunday dinner," Mrs. Roberts told Victoria as they finished their meal, referring to her husband. "He's away at present, livestock auction in Helena. He insists on personally selecting breeding stock for the ranch." "Ranch?" Victoria inquired. "The Academy is my passion," Mrs. Roberts explained, "but the Roberts Ranch is our livelihood. 3,000 acres, 15 miles outside town. Joseph manages it with our sons while I attend to the students' education." Victoria nodded, impressed by this woman who balanced two significant enterprises with apparent ease. "It sounds like you've built something remarkable here." "We've done well enough," Mrs. Roberts acknowledged with characteristic practicality. "Montana rewards those willing to work hard and think clearly." The next several days established a comfortable routine. Victoria taught her Latin classes, prepared lessons in her private room, and gradually came to know her colleagues better. The atmosphere at the Academy provided a welcome respite from the gossip of the town, though she was acutely aware that outside these brick walls she remained Weber's rejected bride to many in Timber Creek. On Friday afternoon, as Victoria dismissed her final class, she noticed Mrs. Roberts standing in the doorway, observing. The older woman waited until the students had filed out before speaking. "You have a natural gift for teaching, Miss Hayes. The students are responding well to your methods." "Thank you," Victoria replied, pleased by the unexpected compliment. "They're bright young people." Mrs. Roberts stepped into the classroom, closing the door behind her. "I have a proposition for you, beyond our current arrangement." Victoria set down the papers she'd been gathering. "I'm listening." "Our enrollment is growing. Families from outlying ranches are sending their children to us rather than east for education. I've been considering adding Greek to our curriculum, alongside Latin. Would such an expansion interest you on a more permanent basis?" The offer caught Victoria by surprise. "You're proposing that I stay on after Mr. Harrison returns?" "If he returns," Mrs. Roberts corrected. "His letter yesterday suggested his mother's illness may be prolonged. But yes, I'm offering you a permanent position, Latin and Greek instruction, with a corresponding increase in salary." Hope blossomed in Victoria's chest. A permanent position meant security, respect, a place in the community based on her skills, rather than her appearance. "I would be very interested, Mrs. Roberts." "Good. We can discuss details after you've had more time at the Academy. For now, consider it an option for your future." She paused, studying Victoria thoughtfully. you've been keeping to the academy grounds all week. It wasn't a question, but Victoria nodded. I've been focused on establishing myself with the students. Understandable, but isolation isn't sustainable. The town must learn to know you as more than Weber's Folly. Tomorrow evening, you'll accompany us to the Timber Creek Literary Society meeting. Victoria hesitated. I'm not certain that would be wise, given recent events. Precisely because of recent events, it's necessary, Mrs. Roberts insisted. Dignity in the face of gossip is the quickest way to silence it. Besides, Dr. Walsh is presenting a paper on Whitman that's sure to scandalize the sewing circle, which should divert attention nicely. Despite her reservations, Victoria found herself agreeing. She couldn't hide within the academy forever if she intended to build a life here. Saturday evening arrived clear and mild. Victoria dressed with care in her best navy silk, a gown that emphasized her natural elegance without apology for her height. Mrs. Roberts nodded approvingly when Victoria joined her and Dr. Walsh in the entrance hall. Excellent. You understand the value of making a proper impression. The Literary Society met in the town hall, a gathering of about 30 of Timber Creek's more educated citizens. Victoria braced herself as they entered, expecting whispers and stares. There were indeed curious glances, but Mrs. Roberts moved through the room with such authoritative grace that most people limited their reactions to polite nods. Eleanor, Thomas. A portly gentleman with an impressive mustache approached them. Delighted you could join us tonight, and this must be your new Latin instructor? Judge Miller, may I present Miss Victoria Hayes, Mrs. Roberts said. Miss Hayes, Judge Miller is our society's president and Timber Creek's foremost legal mind. The judge bowed slightly. A pleasure, Miss Hayes. I understand you're from Boston? We're always grateful for Eastern refinement in our humble community. Before Victoria could respond, a familiar voice cut through the pleasant exchange. Eastern refinement indeed, though I would have thought refinement included honoring one's commitments. Daniel Weber stood nearby, a glass of punch in his hand, and a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to approach. Victoria felt a flush of anger, but maintained her composure. Good evening, Mr. Weber. Judge Miller looked between them, suddenly uncomfortable. Ah, you're acquainted. Briefly, Victoria replied coolly. Mr. Weber and I discovered we had incompatible expectations. Daniel's smile tightened. Miss Hayes failed to accurately represent herself in our correspondence. On the contrary, Victoria countered, keeping her voice level despite the anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. I was entirely truthful about my height. You simply chose not to believe it. A tall shadow fell across their uncomfortable circle as a new figure joined them. Weber, rumbled a deep voice. I see you're making your usual positive impression on the ladies. Victoria turned to find herself looking directly into the eyes of the tallest man she had ever encountered, standing at least 6'6", with broad shoulders and a frame that suggested immense strength. He dominated the space without effort. His dark hair was swept back from a strong-featured face weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes, a startling clear blue, fixed on Daniel with unmistakable disapproval. Anderson, Daniel acknowledged stiffly, I didn't expect to see you at a literary gathering. Evidently, the giant replied dryly. His gaze shifted to Victoria, his expression warming slightly. Ma'am, Jackson Anderson. I don't believe we've had the pleasure. The silence that followed Jackson Anderson's introduction stretched a moment. Too long, as Victoria found herself momentarily speechless. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet a man's eyes. Victoria Hayes, she finally replied, extending her hand. Recently of Boston, currently instructing at Roberts Academy. His handshake was firm, but not overpowering, his calloused palm speaking to years of physical labor despite his evident wealth. His clothes, while practical, were of fine quality. Miss Hayes is our new Latin and potentially Greek instructor, Mrs. Roberts supplied, observing the interaction with undisguised interest. She's brought Eastern educational standards to our humble academy. Latin? Jackson's eyebrows rose. Impressive. Can't say I've had much use for dead languages on Thunder Ridge, but I respect anyone with the patience to master them. Victoria felt herself warming to his unaffected manner. The discipline of language has applications beyond mere translation, Mr. Anderson. Jack, he corrected with a smile that transformed his weathered face. Only the bank and tax collectors call me Mr. Anderson. Daniel Webber shifted uncomfortably, clearly displeased by the direction of the conversation. Anderson, I believe Judge Miller was hoping to discuss the water rights issue with you. Was he now? Jackson replied without bothering to look at Daniel. Funny, he hasn't mentioned it. His attention remained fixed on Victoria. Miss Hayes, I understand you're new to our community. Have you seen much of the area beyond town limits? I've barely seen the town itself, Victoria admitted. My duties at the academy have kept me occupied. A shame. Montana's true character lies beyond Timber Creek's streets. He glanced at Mrs. Roberts. Eleanor, might I impose on your hospitality this coming Saturday? I'd like to show Miss Hayes some of the territory's natural wonders, a proper welcome to Montana. Mrs. Roberts nodded with what appeared to be satisfaction. Certainly, we have no academy functions planned. Victoria found herself caught off guard by the unexpected invitation. That's very kind, but Daniel interrupted my question. Jackson continued smoothly. I was about to ask if you ride, Miss Hayes. I do, she replied, years of proper Boston manners preventing her from the rudeness of refusing outright. Though, it's been some time. Excellent, I'll bring a suitable mount. Ladies in the West ride more frequently than in eastern cities, you'll find. Saturday at 9? Put on the spot, and conscious of the growing audience their conversation had attracted, Victoria could see no graceful way to decline. Thank you, Mr. Ajak. Saturday would be fine. Daniel's expression had grown increasingly sour during this exchange. If you'll excuse me, he muttered, retreating toward a group of merchants gathered near the refreshment table. As he departed, Judge Miller chuckled. You've put Webber's nose out of joint properly, Anderson. Not that I disapprove. Wasn't my intention, Jackson replied mildly, though the glint in his eye suggested otherwise. Just extending proper hospitality to a newcomer. Dr. Walsh, who'd been observing silently, finally spoke up. Anderson here owns Thunder Ridge Ranch, largest cattle operation in the county. Employs half the men in Timber Creek at one time or another. Only when they need extra income, Jackson corrected, or have wives who want them out of the house. The casual comment elicited laughter from those nearby, further dispelling the tension Daniel had created. Victoria found herself relaxing slightly, grateful for the intervention that had shifted attention away from her uncomfortable history with Webber. As the evening progressed, Victoria observed Jackson Anderson moving through the gathering with easy confidence. Unlike Daniel, whose social graces seemed practiced and somewhat forced, Jackson's manner was naturally commanding. People deferred to him not because he demanded it, but because his presence somehow made it the natural order of things. More surprising, however, was how he repeatedly drew Victoria into conversations, ensuring she was introduced to influential members of the community not as Webber's rejected bride, but as Roberts Academy's new Latin scholar. He's quite deliberately rewriting your social standing, Mrs. Roberts murmured, as they watched Jackson engaged in animated discussion with Judge Miller and the bank president, and doing a remarkably efficient job of it. Why would he bother? Victoria asked, genuinely puzzled. He doesn't know me at all. Mrs. Roberts's expression was knowing. Jack Anderson has his reasons. For one, he and Daniel Webber have been at odds for years over business matters. For another, she paused, studying Victoria thoughtfully. Well, let's just say Jack appreciates those who stand out from the crowd. He's never been one to follow convention. Before Victoria could press for clarification, the Literary Society meeting was called to order. Dr. Walsh presented his paper on Walt Whitman, which indeed scandalized several members of the local sewing circle with its references to the poet's more passionate verses. The ensuing debate provided Victoria with valuable insights into Timber Creek society, who valued intellectual discourse over propriety, who clung to Eastern conventions, and who embraced the more liberal attitudes of the frontier. Throughout the discussion, she was aware of Jackson Anderson's occasional glance in her direction, assessing her reactions to various arguments. When she offered a brief but insightful comment on Whitman's use of natural imagery as metaphor, she caught a look of approval on his face. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Jackson approached Victoria once more. "You handled Mrs. Prescott's outrage with remarkable tact," he observed, referring to the elderly woman who had been most vocally offended by Whitman's sensuality. "Teaching has taught me to redirect rather than confront," Victoria replied, "though I found her concern about corrupting the town's youth somewhat overwrought. Whitman speaks truth, even if uncomfortable." Jackson smiled, that same transformation lighting his weathered features. "A diplomat and a scholar. Timber Creek is fortunate to have you, Miss Hayes." He bowed slightly. "Until Saturday, then, 9 o'clock. As he walked away, his towering frame easily visible above the dispersing crowd, Victoria felt Mrs. Roberts watching her with barely concealed amusement. "Well," the older woman said as they made their way back to the academy, "that was illuminating." Victoria chose not to acknowledge the obvious implication. Dr. Walsh's paper was indeed thought-provoking. "I wasn't referring to Thomas's literary analysis, as you well know." Mrs. Roberts chuckled. "Jack Anderson hasn't shown that much interest in a newcomer since the bank sent that young accountant from Chicago who could calculate sums faster than the abacus." "I hardly see the comparison," Victoria objected. "Mr. Anderson was simply being kind to counterbalance Daniel Webber's rudeness. Jack's many things, but simply kind isn't one of them," Mrs. Roberts replied. "He's deliberate in everything he does. If he's taken an interest in you, there's purpose behind it." Victoria frowned, uncertain how to interpret this information. "You make him sound calculating." "Strategic," Mrs. Roberts corrected. "There's a difference. Jack evaluates situations and people carefully, then acts decisively. It's how he built Thunder Ridge from nothing into the most successful ranch in the territory." Back in her room at the academy, Victoria found herself replaying the evening's events. Jackson Anderson was unlike any man she had encountered in Boston, society, or indeed in her limited experience of Timber Creek. His height alone set him apart, but it was more than physical stature that commanded attention. There was something elemental about him, a force of nature contained within civilized constraints. The invitation to ride troubled her, however. After Daniel Webber's rejection, the last thing Victoria wanted was to be the subject of more town gossip. Being seen in Jackson Anderson's company would certainly fuel speculation, particularly given his apparent standing in the community. Yet she found herself reluctant to refuse the opportunity. Montana's vast landscape had captivated her from the train window, and the chance to explore it properly was tempting. Moreover, there had been something refreshingly direct about Jackson's manner. No hidden agenda apparent in his invitation, just genuine interest in showing a newcomer the country he clearly loved. By morning, Victoria had resolved to accept the invitation but maintain a careful distance. She could appreciate Montana's beauty without entangling herself in potentially complicated relationships. Her position at Roberts Academy offered the security and purpose she had sought. Anything more would be an unnecessary risk. This resolution lasted precisely until Saturday morning, when Victoria stepped onto the Academy's front porch at 9 o'clock to find not the expected riding horses, but a handsome open carriage pulled by matched bays. Jackson Anderson sat in the driver's seat, dressed in practical riding clothes that somehow looked more elegant on his imposing frame than Daniel Webber's carefully tailored suits ever had. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," he called, setting the brake, and descending to help her. "I reconsidered the riding plan, thought a carriage might be more comfortable for your first tour of the territory. We can still reach all the places worth seeing." Victoria was touched by the thoughtfulness. "That's very considerate, though I assure you I can manage a horse adequately." "No doubt," he replied, offering his hand to assist her into the carriage. "But this way we can converse more easily. I want to show you Montana, but I'd also like to hear more about Boston and your journey west." As she settled onto the comfortable seat, Victoria noticed a wicker hamper secured behind them. "A picnic, as well. Mrs. Carson at the hotel prepared it," Jackson confirmed, taking his place beside her. "The view from Eagle Bluff deserves proper appreciation, which is difficult on an empty stomach." Despite her initial reservations, Victoria found herself looking forward to the day ahead. Jackson handled the spirited team with easy confidence as they left Timber Creek behind, following a well-maintained road that wound through rolling grasslands toward distant mountains. "Thunder Ridge lies about 20 miles northwest," he explained, gesturing toward a prominent ridgeline visible on the horizon. 5,000 acres of the best grazing land in the territory. Started with 50 head of cattle and a run-down cabin. 12 years ago. "That's remarkable growth in such a short time," Victoria observed. Jackson shrugged. "Timing and tenacity. I arrived when the territory was opening up, but before the big Eastern investors discovered it. And I was too stubborn to quit when winters nearly wiped me out the first 2 years." They passed the next hour in comfortable conversation, Jackson, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of early Montana settlement, Victoria asking thoughtful questions that revealed her genuine interest in the territory's development. The uneven power dynamic she had feared, the influential local and the vulnerable newcomer, never materialized. Instead, they spoke as equals, each bringing different knowledge and perspectives to the exchange. As they approached a dramatic overlook, Jackson guided the horses off the main road and up a narrow track that ended at a flat area with a breathtaking vista. Below them stretched miles of pristine wilderness, a winding river cutting through forests and meadows with snow-capped peaks rising in the distance. "Eagle Bluff," Jackson announced unnecessarily. "Best view in the county." Victoria stood in the carriage for a moment, absorbing the magnificent panorama. "It's glorious," she breathed, "like nothing I've ever seen." Jackson watched her reaction with evident pleasure. "This is the real Montana, Miss Hayes, not Timber Creek's small concerns or even Thunder Ridge's cattle. This is what called me west and keeps me here." For the first time since arriving in the territory, Victoria understood the true appeal of this wild country. Boston's cramped streets and rigid society seemed impossibly distant, as artificial as stage scenery compared to the authentic grandeur spread before her. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said simply. Jackson smiled, that same transformative expression that seemed to erase years from his weathered face. "The day's just beginning, Miss Hayes. Montana has many more wonders to show you." The picnic Jackson had arranged rivaled anything Victoria had experienced in Boston's finest social gatherings. Mrs. Carson had prepared a feast of cold chicken, fresh bread, local cheese, and early spring berries, all packed with obvious care. A bottle of surprisingly good wine completed the repast. "To Montana territory," Jackson proposed, raising his glass. "And new beginnings." Victoria touched her glass to his. "To unexpected vistas," she countered, encompassing both the breathtaking landscape and the surprising turn her situation had taken. As they dined, Jackson asked thoughtful questions about her life in Boston, her teaching experience, and her decision to answer Daniel's advertisement. Victoria found herself revealing more than she had intended, drawn out by his genuine interest and lack of judgment. Most women would have returned east after such a disappointment, he observed as they finished their meal. What made you stay? Victoria considered the question seriously. Pride initially, she admitted. I refused to let Daniel Webber's shallow nature dictate my future. But now, there's something compelling about this place, a sense of possibility that Boston lacked. Jackson nodded, understanding in his clear blue eyes. The territory strips away pretense. Out here, what matters is competence, character, and courage. The rest, social position, family connections, appearances, means little against winter blizzards or summer droughts. Yet Timber Creek still has its hierarchies and prejudices, Victoria pointed out, as Daniel made quite clear. Towns always will, Jackson agreed. It's human nature to create artificial structures. That's why I prefer Thunder Ridge. My cattle don't care about my height or background, just whether I keep them fed and protected. The casual reference to his height surprised Victoria. Until now, neither of them had directly acknowledged their unusual stature. Does it bother you? She asked, emboldened by their candid conversation. Being so much taller than others? A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Did it bother you before Webber made it an issue? It's always been an issue, Victoria corrected. From schoolyard taunts to broken engagements, being too tall for a woman has shaped my entire life. Jackson's expression sobered. I apologize for my glib response. Your experience has clearly been different from mine. For men, unusual height can be an advantage, intimidating in business dealings, respected on the frontier. Though doorways throughout the territory bear the marks of my forehead, this last comment, delivered with dry humor, broke the momentary tension. Victoria found herself laughing, a genuine sound that surprised her with its freedom. I've collected my share of doorframe incidents as well, she confessed, and chandelier mishaps at formal dances. The world is built for smaller people, Jackson agreed. But I wouldn't trade my perspective for theirs. There's something to be said for seeing farther than most. After their meal, they continued their journey, Jackson guiding the carriage along ridgelines and through verdant valleys. He proved a knowledgeable guide, pointing out wildlife, explaining geological formations, and sharing stories of the land's indigenous people with evident respect. By mid-afternoon, they had traveled in a wide arc that brought them to the approach of a substantial property. A wooden arch spanning the road proclaimed Thunder Ridge Ranch in bold letters. I thought you might appreciate seeing the operation, Jackson explained, noting Victoria's questioning look. Unless you'd prefer to return directly to town. I'd be delighted to see Thunder Ridge, Victoria assured him, genuinely curious about this enterprise he had built from nothing. As they passed under the arch, the landscape opened into a well-ordered ranch. Sturdy fences enclosed pastures where cattle grazed. Outbuildings stood in logical arrangement around a central yard. And in the distance, a large two-story house of squared logs and stone commanded a viewpoint overlooking the entire property. Several ranch hands paused in their work to wave as Jackson drove past. Victoria noticed how they straightened in his presence, not from fear, but a kind of natural respect. Most of my men have been with me for years, Jackson remarked. Good workers, loyal. Many started as greenhorns from back east with no ranch experience. I've found character matters more than credentials. At the main house, a young man hurried down the porch steps to take charge of the horses. Afternoon, Mr. Anderson, miss. He touched his hat respectfully to Victoria. Thank you, Tommy, Jackson replied. Give them a good rub-down. We pushed a bit on the hill climb. Yes, sir. Mrs. Henley left refreshments in the study, said you might want them after your ride. Jackson helped Victoria down from the carriage. Mrs. Henley manages the household, he explained. She's convinced I'd starve without her intervention, despite evidence to the contrary from my bachelor years. The interior of the house surprised Victoria. Rather than the rustic furnishings she had expected, Thunder Ridge's main residence combined frontier practicality with genuine elegance. Polished wood floors, comfortable leather furniture, and well-crafted cabinetry created a space that was unmistakably masculine but far from crude. Most striking, however, was the library. One entire wall of the large study was lined with bookshelves, reaching to the ceiling, filled with volumes whose spines showed the wear of regular use rather than decorative display. "You're a reader," Victoria observed with pleasure, drawn immediately to the collection. "Winter evenings are long in Montana," Jackson replied, watching her with evident enjoyment as she examined the shelves. "Books kept me company before I could afford hired help. Now they're old friends I return to regularly." Victoria ran her fingers along the spines, noting titles ranging from practical agricultural texts to poetry, history, and philosophy. "This is a remarkable collection for a frontier ranch. I make twice-yearly trips to Chicago. Books are easier to transport than most luxuries." Jackson moved to a sideboard, where a tray held a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses sized for larger hands. "My quarterly order from London arrived last month. First editions of Tennyson and Hardy, if you'd care to see them." Victoria accepted the offered lemonade, increasingly intrigued by this complex man who ran cattle, quoted Whitman, and collected first editions with equal enthusiasm. "You're not what I expected from a Montana rancher," she admitted. "And what did you expect?" he asked, gesturing for her to take one of the leather armchairs positioned near the large stone fireplace. "Someone more rough-hewn, I suppose. Less worldly." Jackson settled in the chair opposite her, his long legs stretched toward the hearth, where a small fire took the chill from the spring afternoon. "Many of us came west, not to escape education, but to apply it differently. Judge Miller was a respected Philadelphia attorney before turning to frontier justice. Dr. Sullivan at the Timber Creek Clinic studied at Edinburgh. Even Eleanor Roberts held a teaching position at Oberlin before following Joseph West." "And you?" Victoria asked directly. "What brought Jackson Anderson to Montana territory?" Something shifted in his expression, a momentary guardedness that hadn't been present before. "Opportunity primarily, the chance to build something substantial on my own terms." Victoria sensed there was more to the story, but respected his evident desire not to elaborate. Instead, she redirected the conversation. "You've certainly succeeded. Thunder Ridge is impressive by any standard. It's taken 12 years of hard work," he acknowledged, "and more than a few mistakes along the way." He paused, studying her over the rim of his glass. "Which brings me to a matter I've been considering. How to address." Victoria tensed slightly, uncertain of his direction. "Oh? I understand you've accepted a permanent position at Roberts Academy." "Tentatively," Victoria clarified. "Mrs. Roberts and I are still discussing details." Jackson nodded. "Eleanor mentioned you might add Greek to the curriculum, a worthy expansion." "You seem well informed about academy business," Victoria observed, a question implicit in her tone. "I serve on the board of trustees," Jackson explained. "The academy was my idea initially, though Eleanor has made it her own. Timber Creek needed educational options beyond the basic schoolhouse if it was to grow properly." This connection between Jackson and Mrs. Roberts clarified several things for Victoria. The older woman's careful observation of their interactions, her ready agreement to Jackson's invitation, her cryptic comments about his strategic nature. "I see," Victoria said carefully. "So my employment falls under your purview as a trustee." Jackson's eyebrows rose. "Not at all. Eleanor maintains complete autonomy in staffing decisions. My interest in your position is entirely separate from academy governance." "What is your interest, then?" Victoria asked directly, her Boston reserve giving way to frontier directness. Twofold, Jackson replied with equal candor. First, I believe, you bring valuable skills and perspective to our community. Second, he hesitated, then continued with careful precision. I find myself intrigued by a woman who maintains her dignity, despite public humiliation, who builds new opportunities rather than retreating, and who, if you'll pardon my frankness, stands eye to eye with me in more ways than the merely physical. The plain-spoken assessment rendered Victoria momentarily speechless. In Boston, such direct expression of interest would have been considered shockingly improper. Yet here, in this frontier study with afternoon light streaming through tall windows, it seemed perfectly aligned with the territory's unvarnished honesty. "Mr. Anderson, Jack," she began, uncertain how to respond. "I'm flattered by your interest, but I've only just established my footing here. After the situation with Daniel Webber, I'm not eager to become the subject of more town speculation." "Understandable," he acknowledged, "and I have no wish to complicate your position. I merely wanted to be clear about my admiration and interest without the usual social obfuscation." His straightforward approach was both disarming and refreshing. No games, no hidden agenda, just honest expression of sentiment with space for her response. "I appreciate your candor," Victoria said finally, "and I admit to finding you equally intriguing. But I would ask for time and patience. My trust has been recently damaged." Jackson nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Time and patience I can offer. Montana wasn't built in a day, nor Thunder Ridge in a season. Worthwhile endeavors deserve proper development." As they finished their refreshments, Jackson offered to show Victoria the rest of the ranch buildings before returning her to the academy. The tour revealed the full scope of his operation: the breeding program for developing cattle suited to Montana's climate, the innovative irrigation system he'd designed for hayfields, the comfortable but practical bunkhouse where his ranch hands lived. Throughout, Victoria observed how different workers interacted with Jackson, the easy respect that flowed both ways, the clear communication, the occasional good-natured jest that spoke to comfortable familiarity without crossing into disrespect. "Your men genuinely respect you," she noted as they walked back toward the waiting carriage. "Not just as their employer." "We depend on each other out here," Jackson replied simply. "A man who treats his workers as disposable soon finds himself alone against Montana's challenges." The principle seemed to apply to his approach to all relationships, Victoria reflected. Value people for their authentic contributions, communicate honestly, build connections based on mutual respect rather than social convention or superficial attributes. As the sun began its descent toward distant mountains, they reluctantly started the journey back to Timber Creek. Victoria found herself viewing the landscape differently on the return trip, not just as spectacular scenery, but as a place where she might genuinely belong, where her unique qualities could be assets rather than liabilities. "Thank you for today," she said as the academy came into view. "You've shown me a Montana I hadn't imagined." Jackson guided the team expertly down the final stretch of road. The territory reveals itself differently to each person. Some see only hardship and isolation. Others discover freedom and possibility. "And which did you find?" Victoria asked. His smile carried a hint of private knowledge. "Both, often on the same day, but I've never regretted choosing this life, despite its challenges." As he helped her down from the carriage at the academy steps, Jackson held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Would you consider another expedition next Saturday? There's a hidden waterfall in the eastern hills that few Timber Creek residents have seen." Victoria found herself nodding before conscious deliberation. "I'd like that very much." "Until Saturday, then," he said, tipping his hat before climbing back into the carriage. Victoria watched him drive away, the tall figure commanding the driver's seat with natural authority. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt something beyond mere determination to survive her circumstances, a genuine excitement about possibilities unfolding before her, as vast and promising as the territory itself. News of Victoria's excursion with Jackson Anderson spread through Timber Creek like wildfire, transforming her status from object of ridicule to subject of intense curiosity overnight. Students at the academy regarded her with newfound interest, while shopkeepers, who had previously been coolly polite, now offered warm greetings and inquired about her comfort in their town. "It's remarkable how quickly attitudes change," Victoria observed to Mrs. Roberts as they reviewed lesson plans in the academy office Monday afternoon. "If people align themselves with power," Mrs. Roberts replied pragmatically. "Jack Anderson represents the most significant influence in this county. His apparent interest elevates you by association." Victoria frowned. "That hardly seems a solid foundation for genuine acceptance." "It's a beginning," Mrs. Roberts countered. "Initial access granted through Jack's endorsement gives you the opportunity to prove your own worth. Don't underestimate the value of a proper introduction in frontier society." Before Victoria could respond, a knock interrupted them. Miss Collins, the science teacher, appeared at the office door, her youthful face flushed with excitement. "Pardon the interruption, Mrs. Roberts, but there's a delivery for Miss Hayes." Following Miss Collins to the academy's entrance hall, Victoria found a young ranch hand holding an exquisite bouquet of wildflowers, arranged with artistic care. "From Mr. Anderson, ma'am," the boy explained, presenting the flowers with obvious pride in his mission. "He said these reminded him of your conversation." Victoria accepted the bouquet, noticing a small card nestled among the blossoms. Under the curious gazes of Miss Collins and two passing students, she read the brief message, "The world is built for smaller people, but I wouldn't trade my perspective for theirs. Saturday remains a welcome prospect. J.A., the thoughtful reference to their conversation touched Victoria deeply. Not roses or cultivated blooms that might have been ordered from Denver, but Montana wildflowers, authentic natural beauty that represented their shared experience. "Thank you," she told the waiting messenger. "Please tell Mr. Anderson the flowers are lovely." The boy nodded, clearly prepared for this response. Mr. Anderson also asked if you might like to attend the county agricultural meeting with him Thursday evening. Said it wasn't as pretty as a waterfall, but important to community matters. Victoria hesitated, aware of Miss Collins's barely contained curiosity. A second public appearance with Jackson would cement speculation about their relationship. Yet, she found herself nodding. "Please tell him I would be pleased to attend." After the messenger departed, Miss Collins could no longer contain herself. "Jackson Anderson sent you flowers and an invitation. Do you have any idea how extraordinary that is?" "I gather Mr. Anderson doesn't typically send botanical arrangements," Victoria replied dryly, carrying the bouquet toward her classroom. "He doesn't send anything to anyone." Miss Collins hurried alongside her. "Lizzie Palmer, her father owns the Mercantile. She's been trying to catch his attention for 3 years. Baked him pies. Had her father deliver special orders to Thunder Ridge personally so she could accompany him. Even fell off her horse deliberately near his property once." "How innovative," Victoria commented, amused despite herself. "He sent his foreman to help her and continued his ride." Miss Collins's eyes were wide with the drama of it all. "Jack Anderson has been the most eligible bachelor in 3 counties since he established Thunder Ridge, and he's never shown particular interest in any woman. Until now." Victoria arranged the wildflowers in a vase on her desk, considering this information. Jackson's direct expression of interest took on additional significance with this context. If he truly was as selective in his attentions as Miss Collins suggested, his forthright approach to Victoria represented a substantial departure from his established pattern. The next morning brought another surprise visitor. Victoria was reviewing Latin translations before her first class when a shadow darkened her classroom doorway. Looking up, she found Daniel Webber standing there, his expression an uncomfortable mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Miss Hayes," he began, hat in hand. "Might I have a word?" Victoria maintained her composure despite her surprise. "Mr. Webber, this is unexpected." He glanced around the empty classroom before stepping inside. "I realize my presence is unwelcome, but I felt compelled to speak with you." "About what, precisely?" Victoria remained seated, unwilling to grant him the courtesy of rising. Daniel shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "Your association with Jackson Anderson." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware my associations required your approval." "Not approval," he said hastily. "Caution. Anderson isn't what he appears to be." "And what does he appear to be?" Victoria asked, her tone cool. "A successful rancher, a community leader, a refined gentleman despite his frontier business." Daniel twisted his hat in his hands. "But there are aspects to his history that give cause for concern." Victoria studied the man who had publicly humiliated her, trying to discern his motivation. "Why would you possibly care about my welfare now, Mr. Webber? You made your opinion of me quite clear." A flush crept up Daniel's neck. "I behaved poorly, I acknowledge that. But regardless of our personal differences, I wouldn't want to see any woman endangered through ignorance." "Endangered?" Victoria repeated skeptically. "That seems dramatic." Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Have you wondered why a man of Anderson's apparent refinement and success remains unmarried? Why he settled in remote Montana rather than establishing himself in Chicago or St. Louis? Why no one in Timber Creek knows anything concrete about his life before Thunder Ridge?" "Many people come west seeking fresh starts," Victoria countered. "It's hardly unusual." "Fresh starts, yes. But Anderson guards his past with particular vigilance." Daniel's expression grew earnest. "There are rumors." "I have no interest in rumors, Mr. Webber," Victoria interrupted firmly. "Especially from someone who has already demonstrated poor judgment regarding my character." Daniel straightened. "You think this is petty rivalry? I assure you my concern is genuine. Ask Anderson about Philadelphia sometime. Watch his reaction." Before Victoria could respond, Mrs. Roberts appeared in the doorway, her expression glacial as she regarded Daniel. "Mr. Webber, I don't recall seeing your name in our appointment book." Daniel replaced his hat, nodding stiffly to both women. "I was just leaving. Good day, Miss Hayes. Consider what I've said." After he departed, Mrs. Roberts turned to Victoria with raised eyebrows. "What did that weasel want?" "To warn me about Jackson Anderson, apparently," Victoria replied, still processing the strange encounter. "He implied there's something dangerous in Jack's past, particularly connected to Philadelphia." Mrs. Roberts made a sound of disgust. "Classic Webber, sowing doubts when he can't get his way. I wouldn't put much stock in his warnings. You know Jack well," Victoria observed. "Is there truth to any of it? His past before Montana?" Something guarded crossed Mrs. Roberts' face. "Jack's history is his own to share or keep private. What I know is the man he is today. Honorable, fair, and the best neighbor Timber Creek could ask for. If he has secrets, they haven't prevented him from building a life of integrity here." The measured response was telling in its careful phrasing. Mrs. Roberts wasn't denying that Jackson had secrets, merely suggesting they didn't define his character now. Despite her determination to dismiss Daniel's warnings as the product of jealousy, Victoria found herself troubled. Not because she believed Jackson dangerous, but because the exchange highlighted how little she truly knew about him beyond their brief interactions and his current standing in the community. Thursday evening arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. Victoria dressed with particular care in her best navy dress, the one that accentuated her height with its clean lines rather than attempting to minimize it. As she fastened her mother's pearl earrings, one of the few pieces of jewelry she had brought west, Victoria resolved to set aside Daniel's insinuations and judge Jackson Anderson solely on his demonstrated character. Jackson arrived punctually. At the academy, the same carriage from their excursion freshly polished. His expression as Victoria descended the steps sent a surprising flutter through her composed exterior. "You look magnificent," he said simply, helping her into the carriage. "The agricultural meeting must be more formal than I anticipated," Victoria replied, settling her skirts. Jackson laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "Hardly. Most attendees will be in work clothes, barely brushed free of hay. But some occasions merit special effort regardless of external expectations." His own attire reflected this philosophy, a well-tailored black coat over a crisp white shirt, his usual rugged appearance refined but not fundamentally altered. He looked both powerful and approachable, commanding without intimidation. "I should warn you," Jackson said as they traveled toward the town hall. "These meetings can grow heated. Water rights and grazing boundaries inspire passionate debate. Among ranchers, should I expect fisticuffs?" Victoria asked lightly. "Not with Judge Miller presiding, though it's been a near thing on occasion." His blue eyes crinkled at the corners. "Your presence will likely improve behavior considerably. Most of these men rarely encounter a lady with your combination of intelligence and dignity." The compliment, delivered without flirtation, but as simple fact, warmed Victoria more than elaborate flattery ever could. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived, filled with an eclectic mix of ranch owners, farmers, merchants, and local officials. A noticeable hush fell over the assembled group as Jackson escorted Victoria through the door, his towering presence and her matching height creating an undeniably striking pair. Judge Miller approached immediately, genuine pleasure in his greeting. "Anderson, didn't expect to see you with such elegant company tonight. Miss Hayes, you bring much-needed refinement to our provincial gathering." As Jackson introduced her to various community members, Victoria observed the complex social dynamics at play. Most men greeted Jackson with evident respect, though she detected underlying currents ranging from wary deference to genuine affection. A few, particularly a group clustered near Daniel Webber, maintained a cool distance, exchanging significant glances as Jackson moved through the room. "Political factions," Victoria murmured as they found seats near the front. Jackson nodded, impressed by her perception. "Essentially, Timber Creek has two visions for its future. Some, like Webber, want rapid expansion, more businesses, Eastern investors, development at any cost. Others prefer measured growth that preserves what makes Montana unique while still improving opportunity. And you lead the preservationists," Victoria surmised. "I advocate balance," Jackson corrected. "Progress without destruction. It's made me enemies among those who see only potential profits." Victoria glanced toward Daniel, who was watching them with barely concealed animosity. "Some particularly committed enemies, it seems." Jackson followed her gaze, his expression hardening slightly. "Webber has particular grievances beyond policy disagreements. Has he approached you?" Before Victoria could respond, Judge Miller called the meeting to order. For the next hour, she observed the community's governance in action as ranchers debated water access during the upcoming dry season. Merchants presented proposals for road improvements, and farmers argued for protection from cattle encroachment. On croplands, throughout, Jackson participated with measured authority, speaking rarely but commanding complete attention when he did, offering solutions that balanced competing interests rather than favoring his own considerable holdings. It was leadership by example rather than imposition, and Victoria found herself increasingly impressed by his approach. When the meeting concluded, several people approached them, clearly eager to engage with Anderson's new friend, as Victoria overheard one rancher describe her. Rather than drawing attention to himself, Jackson skillfully directed these conversations to include Victoria's perspectives on education and community development. "You're deliberately establishing me as more than an ornament," she observed quietly as they finally made their way toward the exit. "I'm allowing them to see what I already recognize," Jackson countered. "Your value to Timber Creek extends far beyond decorative qualities or your connection to me." The simple affirmation of her worth as an individual, so different from Daniel's, concern about her height reflecting on his status, touched Victoria deeply. Whatever secrets might lurk in Jackson Anderson's past, his present actions demonstrated a fundamentally different understanding of partnership than she had previously encountered. As they stepped onto the town hall porch, the spring evening had turned unseasonably cold. Without comment, Jackson removed his coat and placed it around Victoria's shoulders, the garment comically long, on even her tall frame, but wonderfully warm from his body heat. "Thank you," she said, "both for the coat and the evening's careful consideration." "My pleasure," he replied, his deep voice carrying in the quiet night. "Though I suspect our official agricultural discussions hardly compare to Boston's cultural entertainments." Victoria smiled up at him, suddenly aware of their proximity on the narrow porch steps. "I found it far more engaging than most Boston gatherings. Real decisions affecting real lives rather than superficial social maneuvering." For a moment they stood silent in the moonlight, two tall figures perfectly matched, yet still learning each other's contours. Then Jackson offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. "May I see you safely back to the academy, Miss Hayes?" "You may indeed, Mr. Anderson," she replied, slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. Neither noticed Daniel Webber, watching from the shadows across the street, his expression darkening as they walked away. Saturday's expedition to the hidden waterfall exceeded Victoria's already high expectations. Jackson had arranged for riding horses this time, correctly assessing that Victoria's confidence had grown since their first outing. The spirited mare he provided matched her height and temperament perfectly, tall, dignified, but with an undercurrent of energy that responded to a firm, gentle hand. "Persephone is particular about her riders," Jackson explained, as Victoria easily mounted the impressive animal. "She seems to have approved of you." Their journey took them through pine forests and across hidden meadows, carpeted with early wildflowers. Jackson proved an engaging companion, sharing knowledge of local plant life and wildlife without lecturing, asking thoughtful questions about Victoria's teaching methods, and occasionally lapsing into comfortable silence that required no filling. The waterfall itself remained hidden until they rounded a final bend in the narrow mountain trail. Victoria gasped as it came into view, a shimmering ribbon of water cascading nearly 100 feet down a rugged cliff face into a crystal-clear pool. Below, rainbow mist danced where water met stone, creating an ethereal beauty that seemed out of place in the rugged Montana landscape. "It's breathtaking," Victoria murmured as they dismounted near the pool. "The Blackfoot called this place Tears of the Mountain Spirit," Jackson said, securing their horses to a nearby pine. "Legend claims the spirit fell in love with a mortal woman who couldn't survive in his realm, so he remains here, eternally weeping for what might have been." "How poetic," Victoria observed, surprised by his knowledge of indigenous stories, "and rather melancholy." "Most lasting beauty carries an element of sadness," Jackson replied, his expression momentarily distant. Then, visibly refocusing, he produced a small parcel from his saddlebag. "I thought you might like to sketch. Mrs. Roberts mentioned your artistic talents." The package contained a quality sketchbook and drawing pencils, another thoughtful gesture that demonstrated Jackson's attention to details about her interests. "Thank you," Victoria said, genuinely moved. though I must warn you, my sketches are amateur efforts at best." They spent a peaceful hour by the waterfall, Victoria attempting to capture its fluid beauty on paper while Jackson arranged the picnic. Lunch he had packed. Unlike their previous excursion's formal meal, today's fare was simple trail food: hearty bread, smoked venison, early strawberries, and coffee brewed over a small fire. As they ate, Victoria found herself studying Jackson's profile against the wilderness backdrop. There was something essentially right about him in this setting. His unusual height and strength, proportionate to the grand landscape, his composed demeanor reflecting the mountain's quiet permanence. "You're watching me," he observed without turning his head. "I'm trying to reconcile different pieces of Jackson Anderson," Victoria admitted. "The sophisticated book collector, the practical rancher, the community leader, the wilderness guide. You contain multitudes, as Whitman might say." He smiled at the literary reference. "Don't we all? You're equally complex, the proper Bostonian teacher, the courageous mail-order bride, the woman who stands her ground against public humiliation. Perhaps Montana simply allows more room for our complete selves," Victoria suggested. "Fewer constraints than Eastern society imposes." "That's part of its appeal," Jackson agreed. "Though even here, people eventually try to impose limitations. Human nature craves categorization." Victoria hesitated, then decided to address the question that had lingered since Daniel's warning. "Did you come to Montana to escape categorization, Jack?" He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes sharp with sudden attention. "What specifically are you asking, Victoria?" His directness deserved equal honesty. "Daniel Weber suggested your past holds secrets, particularly regarding Philadelphia." Jackson's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. After a moment of silence, broken only by the waterfall's steady music, he sighed. "Weber has a talent for meddling where he's not wanted." "You don't have to explain," Victoria began, already regretting raising the subject. "No, but I choose to," Jackson interrupted gently, "not because Weber demanded it, but because you deserve to understand the man who's been courting your attention." The simple acknowledgement of his intentions, courting, sent a flutter through Victoria, despite the serious turn in conversation. Jackson stared into the misted pool for a long moment before speaking. "I was born James Anderson Phillips, son of Harold Phillips, president of First Mercantile Bank of Philadelphia." The revelation stunned Victoria. First Mercantile was one of Philadelphia's oldest and most prestigious financial institutions. The Phillips family ranked among the city's elite social circles. "I grew up with every advantage: the best schools, European travel, entree to Philadelphia's highest society." Jackson's voice held no nostalgia for these privileges. "I was being groomed to follow my father into banking, a future plotted from birth without consultation." "What happened?" Victoria asked gently. "I disappointed expectations by preferring engineering to finance. At Cornell, I studied hydraulics and structural design rather than economics. My father tolerated this eccentricity, assuming I'd eventually surrender to my responsibilities." Jackson fell silent again, visibly organizing difficult memories. "When I was 25, I discovered irregularities in the bank's accounts, funds being diverted from client investments into speculative ventures. My father was embezzling from his own institution," Victoria gasped softly. "How awful for you." When confronted, he justified it as temporary reallocation, said the clients would never miss what they didn't know was borrowed. Jackson's expression hardened. "I was naive enough to believe he would correct course if given the chance. Instead, he accelerated his activities, growing increasingly desperate as investments failed." "Did you report him?" Victoria asked. Jackson shook his head. "Family loyalty prevented me, my greatest moral failure. Instead, I tried reasoning with him again. The confrontation turned violent. My father suffered a stroke during our argument and died 3 days later, Victoria reached across the space between them, placing her hand on his. "Jack, I'm so sorry." "The irregularities came to light during estate settlement," he continued, turning his hand to clasp hers. "Though never publicly linked to my father, the scandal destroyed the Phillips name in Philadelphia banking circles. My mother retreated to our country estate, my sister's marital prospects were damaged, and I found myself unwelcome in the world I'd been raised to command." "So you came west," Victoria concluded softly. "Not immediately. I spent 2 years trying to make amends, using my inheritance to quietly cover investor losses when possible. But Philadelphia society has long memories and limited forgiveness. Eventually I realized nothing I did would ever separate me from my father's disgrace." Jackson's gaze returned to the waterfall. "I traveled west, changed my name to my mother's maiden name and my middle name, and determined to build something honest with my remaining resources. Thunder Ridge represents 12 years of that effort." Victoria processed this revelation, understanding now the careful propriety of his business dealings, his emphasis on fair treatment of others, his leadership style based on earned respect rather than imposed authority. All reflected a man determined to live counter to his father's example. "Have you told many people this story?" she asked. "Only Joseph and Eleanor Roberts know the full truth," Jackson admitted. "Not from shame, but because I wanted to be judged on my actions here, not events in Philadelphia I couldn't control." "Yet you've told me," Victoria observed quietly. His blue eyes met hers directly. "Because I care what you think of me, because whatever grows between us should be founded on truth." The simple declaration, unadorned with flowery sentiments or excessive promises, moved Victoria more deeply than elaborate protestations would have. Here was a man who understood that genuine connection required honest vulnerability, not perfect presentation. "Thank you for trusting me," she said simply. They remained by the waterfall a while longer, conversation gradually shifting to lighter subjects as the weight of revelation eased. By the time they mounted their horses for the return journey, something fundamental had shifted between them, a deeper understanding beyond mutual attraction or shared experiences. As they approached the academy in the golden light of late afternoon, Victoria was acutely conscious of every glance cast their way by Timber Creek residents. Their outings had become regular enough to establish a pattern that even the most oblivious citizen couldn't miss. Jackson Anderson was publicly, deliberately paying court to the tall schoolteacher from Boston. Mrs. Roberts awaited them on the academy porch, her expression unusually grave. "Jack, Victoria, I'm glad you've returned promptly. There's a situation requiring attention." Victoria dismounted with Jackson's assistance, immediately concerned by the older woman's tone. "Has something happened at the academy?" "Not directly, but there's been an incident in town that may affect you both." Mrs. Roberts glanced between them. "Perhaps you should come inside." In the academy's private study, they found Judge Miller, waiting, his normally jovial expression replaced by official seriousness. "Anderson," he acknowledged with a nod. "Miss Hayes, apologize for interrupting your Saturday, but a matter has arisen that requires immediate discussion." "What's happened, Thomas?" Jackson asked directly. Judge Miller cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Anonymous letters were delivered throughout town this morning, quite specific letters regarding your background in Philadelphia." Victoria felt Jackson stiffen beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "I see. They detail the first mercantile scandal, your father's death, your change of identity," the judge continued. "Present everything in the worst possible light, naturally." "Naturally," Jackson echoed dryly. Mrs. Roberts interjected, "The timing is obviously intended to damage your standing before Tuesday's town council vote on the railroad spur location." Victoria glanced between them, connecting political threads she hadn't fully appreciated. The railroad's arrival in Timber Creek would transform the community's economic prospects, with property near the station becoming extremely valuable. Jackson and Daniel represented opposing factions in determining that location. Who would have access to this information? Victoria asked. It seems remarkably detailed for frontier gossip. That's the concerning part, Judge Miller replied. The letters reference banking documents and Philadelphia newspaper accounts that wouldn't be readily available in Montana Territory. Someone went to considerable effort, Jackson observed, his calm voice belying the tension Victoria sensed. In his tall frame, Daniel Weber, Mrs. Roberts stated flatly, he's been hinting about your past for weeks, and the railroad vote directly affects his investments. Judge Miller raised a cautioning hand. We have no proof, Eleanor. We don't need legal proof to recognize the obvious, she retorted. The only question is how he obtained the information. Jackson had been silent, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. Now he spoke with careful precision. Whether Weber or someone else, the essential facts in these letters are true, however maliciously framed. I've never denied my background to those who asked directly. But most people never thought to ask, Mrs. Roberts pointed out. They've accepted you as Jackson Anderson, successful rancher and community leader. This deliberately undermines 15 years of established reputation. Victoria watched the exchange with growing concern, not for Jackson's revealed past, which he had already shared with her, but for the calculated cruelty of using that past as a weapon against him. The letter's timing clearly meant to maximize. Damage to both his public standing and the policy he supported demonstrated a vindictiveness that troubled her deeply. What do you intend to do? She asked Jackson quietly. His blue eyes, when they met hers, held steady resolve rather than defensiveness or anger. Address it directly. No hiding, no apologizing for circumstances beyond my control, no retreating from principles I believe benefit this community. The simple, straightforward response, so characteristic of his approach to challenges, reassured Victoria. Whatever storm these anonymous letters might generate, Jackson would face it with the same integrity he had demonstrated since her arrival in Timber Creek. What remained uncertain was how the community would respond, and what this sudden controversy might mean for her own position as the woman increasingly linked to the man at its center. The town hall was packed beyond capacity. News of the anonymous letters had spread throughout Timber Creek, drawing citizens who normally showed little interest in local governance. Faces both familiar and unfamiliar turned toward the door as Victoria entered alongside Mrs. Roberts, murmurs rising like disturbed bees at their appearance. Quite the turnout, Mrs. Roberts observed dryly. Nothing like scandal to inspire civic participation. Victoria nodded, scanning the crowd for Jackson. She hadn't seen him since Judge Miller's warning the previous day. Though he had promised to address the situation directly, she wondered if the sheer volume of sudden opposition might have changed his approach. Her concerns vanished when she spotted him at the front of the hall, engaged in calm conversation with Judge Miller and several town council members. Even surrounded by controversy, Jackson maintained the composed dignity that had first drawn her attention. His height made him impossible to miss, just as her own tall figure now drew curious stares as she made her way through the packed room. Daniel Weber stood with a cluster of merchants near the side wall, his expression a study in barely concealed satisfaction. When he noticed Victoria, something like regret briefly crossed his features before he looked away. Victoria and Mrs. Roberts found seats near the front as Judge Miller called the meeting to order. As many of you know, the judge began, we gather tonight to vote on the proposed location for Timber Creek's railroad station. However, given recent communications circulating through our community, Mr. Anderson has requested a few minutes to address the gathering before we proceed to official business. A hush fell over the crowd as Jackson rose and moved to the center of the platform. For a moment, he simply stood there, his impressive height allowing him to meet every gaze in the room. 15 years ago, he began without preamble, I arrived in Montana Territory with a new name and determination to build an honest life far from Philadelphia scandal. The anonymous letters many of you received yesterday contain partial truths about that history, facts I've never denied when asked directly, but never volunteered to those who didn't inquire. Victoria watched the audience reaction, noting the mixture of surprise, curiosity, and judgment on various faces. I was born James Anderson Phillips, Jackson continued, his deep voice steady. My father's financial improprieties at First Mercantile Bank and his subsequent death created a scandal that tarnished our family name beyond recovery in Eastern circles. Rather than live forever in that shadow, I chose to seek a place where I might be judged by my own actions rather than my father's failures. He paused, his gaze momentarily finding Victoria's, before continuing. Some might call this deceptive. I consider it a reasonable desire for fair evaluation. Thunder Ridge Ranch represents 12 years of honest labor, built without shortcuts or exploitation. My position on community matters, including the railroad station location, reflects what I believe benefits all of Timber Creek, not just my personal interests. Judge Miller stepped forward. Thank you, Anderson. Does anyone wish to address questions? To Mr. Anderson, before we proceed to our scheduled vote? The tense silence broke as several hands rose. For the next half hour, Jackson answered inquiries about his past with straightforward honesty, acknowledging family wealth that provided his initial capital, explaining his engineering education that informed ranch innovations, neither apologizing for nor defending his decision to adopt a simplified version of his name. Throughout, Victoria observed Daniel Weber growing increasingly frustrated as the crowd's reaction shifted from suspicious murmuring to respectful attention. Whatever damage the anonymous letters had been intended to inflict seemed to be dissipating under Jackson's candid responses. Finally, Mrs. Prescott, the same elderly woman who had been scandalized by Whitman's poetry, rose shakily to her feet. Mr. Anderson, she began, her voice quavering but clear, or Mr. Phillips, if you prefer. Anderson is my legal name now, ma'am, Jackson corrected gently. She nodded. Mr. Anderson, then. I've lived in Timber Creek for 22 years. Arrived when it was hardly more than a trading post. I've seen men come and go, some honest, some not. What matters in a frontier community isn't where a person comes from, but what they contribute and how they conduct themselves among neighbors. She straightened to her full height, which barely reached Jackson's shoulder. In my estimation, you've conducted yourself as a gentleman and a valuable citizen. These anonymous accusations say more about their cowardly author than about you. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Judge Miller seized the moment. If there are no further questions for Mr. Anderson, we should proceed to our scheduled vote. What followed was anticlimactic. The town council, perhaps influenced by the room's shift in sentiment, voted 4-1 to approve Jackson's proposed railroad location, a site that would benefit the town's existing businesses rather than the undeveloped land Daniel had been quietly purchasing on speculation. As the meeting dispersed, Victoria watched Daniel storm out, his face flushed with anger at his thwarted plans. Several citizens approached Jackson, offering handshakes and words of support that suggested the anonymous letters had ultimately strengthened rather than damaged his standing. When the crowd finally thinned enough for Victoria to reach him, Jackson's expression softened visibly. You came, he said simply. Did you doubt I would? She asked. He shook his head. Not your attendance, but perhaps your continued association after such public controversy. Many women would prefer distance from a suddenly contested figure. Victoria smiled. I'm not many women, as you've often noted. No, he agreed, a warmth in his blue eyes that had nothing to do with the overheated room. You're singular in every respect. They walked together from the town hall into the cool spring evening, conscious of curious glances, but beyond caring about public speculation. The moon hung full above Timber Creek's modest skyline, casting long shadows from their tall figures. "What happens now?" Victoria asked as they paused in the town square. "With the railroad vote decided, development will begin next month. Timber Creek will grow, hopefully in ways that preserve what makes it special while creating new opportunities." "Ika meant with us," Victoria clarified softly. Jackson turned to face her fully, moonlight silvering his features. "That depends entirely on what you want, Victoria. I've made my interest clear from the beginning. It's only grown stronger with each conversation, each shared experience." He took her hand, his calloused palm warm against her fingers. "I came to Montana, seeking a place where I could build something genuine, free from society's constraints. You came seeking similar freedom, though under different circumstances." Victoria nodded, remembering her desperate hope as the train carried her west, her determination after Daniel's rejection, her gradual discovery of purpose at Robert's Academy. "I believe we recognize something essential in each other," Jackson continued. "Not just our unusual height, though that creates a certain unique compatibility." Victoria smiled at the gentle humor. "A rare perspective on the world." "Precisely." His expression grew serious again. "I'm asking if you might consider building something permanent together. Not immediately. I understand you value your independence and the position you've established. But eventually, as a partnership founded on mutual respect and genuine affection." The proposal, characteristic in its directness and lack of artifice, touched Victoria deeply. Unlike Daniel's calculated offer based on practical arrangement, Jackson's invitation centered on shared values and emotional connection while still respecting her need for autonomy. "I would consider that very seriously, Jack," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotions flowing beneath. "In fact, I believe I've already begun that consideration." His smile transformed his weathered face, years of careful reserve melting away. Without regard for potential observers, he drew her into an embrace, their matched heights allowing them to stand eye to eye, heart to heart in perfect alignment. "I felt truly seen for the first time the day you walked into the literary society meeting," he confessed. "Not just physically matched, but recognized in some deeper way." "I felt that too," Victoria admitted, "though I resisted acknowledging it at first, understandably cautious given your experience with Weber." Jackson's arms tightened slightly around her. "I'm grateful for his short-sightedness. His rejection created the possibility for us to find each other." Victoria laughed softly. "Perhaps we should thank him someday." "Perhaps." Jackson released her, though he kept her hand in his as they began walking toward Robert's Academy. "Though I suspect he's suffered enough, losing both his mail-order bride and his railroad speculation in the span of a few weeks." 6 months later, Victoria Hayes became Victoria Anderson in a ceremony held at Thunder Ridge Ranch. The wedding, unlike their courtship, was private, attended only by close friends, including the Roberts family, Judge Miller, and Academy faculty. Victoria wore a gown she had designed herself, its clean lines emphasizing rather than minimizing her height. Jackson stood beside her not in Eastern formal wear, but in the finest version of his everyday rancher's attire, authentic to the life they would share. Their vows, written together during evening conversations on Thunder Ridge's wide porch, spoke of partnership, mutual respect, and the freedom they had each found in Montana's expansive landscape and in each other's acceptance. As they stood before their gathered friends, two tall figures perfectly matched against Montana's dramatic horizon, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought her west. What had begun in desperate hope, continued through humiliation and uncertainty, had ultimately led to this moment of profound belonging. Boston society had deemed her too tall, Daniel Webber too intimidating in her stature, but Jackson Anderson had recognized her height as just one facet of the woman he had come to love, not a flaw to be overcome, but a quality to be celebrated alongside her intelligence, courage, and dignity. Together, they would build a future as expansive as the Montana sky, standing tall against whatever challenges awaited, their matched perspectives allowing them to see possibilities others might miss on the ever-evolving frontier. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.